should get started. Well, number one, it's a pleasure to introduce Tim Benton, to have him back here at the Berlage in this remote way. Not what we expected. We had hoped, we were looking forward to having Tim back in Delft, but instead he's in his country house outside Paris, and we are all here remotely. Today's lecture will focus on, it's the second in our series on building competitions. So Tim will speak on the history of the Palace of the League of Nations competition, exploring the juries, the policies, the entire process of that exhibition, that competition, excuse me. Tim is Professor Emeritus of Art History at the Open University. He also taught at Columbia, Williams College, and at the EPFL in Lausanne. He was the course team chair of the famous A305, History of Architecture and Design, 1890 to 1939, the first Open University course on the history of architecture. His research interests include Le Corbusier's work on the 1920s and 30s, the history of modern architecture and design. For several years, he's been working on Le Corbusier's domestic architectural designs from 1914 to 1935, which includes a study of the architectural drawings and documents associated with these projects. He's also developed computer software for the analysis of architectural drawings as part of his research. This is his first Zoom lecture, but as somebody who essentially was involved in the first proto Zoom experience with his online course at the Open University, I think this is, well, it's apropos that you are here in this way, reconfigured for the 21st century, of course, under another set of circumstances. Well, before we give you the screen, so to speak, thank you very much for accepting our offer, our invitation to revisit this material and to frame and to spend the time going back to an old friend as the Palace of the League of Nations, as they say. So thank you very much, Tim. We look forward to the talk.
Okay, thanks, Salomon. Now, how do I just, while I get started?
Share screen?
Yeah.
I have a question. Are you recording the lecture, Solomon?
Yes, it's recorded.
Okay,
right.
good.
Can you see my presentation?
Yes, success.
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
Excellent.
Right. Okay, so this is a big subject. It's 14 kilometers long, the subject. This is a picture of Weiderfeld looking at the special space built to house the 377 drawings for the competition for the League of Nations when it was opened in July 1927. So it's a big subject, and I've got a lot of things to say, so I hope I won't go on too long. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to start by reading the first little bit, and then I'll try and be a bit more open. The subject of this session is an international architectural competition, or again, it isn't, because this competition was about a lot of things, which in the end, architecture took a backseat to diplomacy. Literally, because in the end, the decision to choose the design for the new League of Nations Palace was made not by a jury of architects, but a select group of 5 diplomats, none of whom knew anything about architecture. Actually, this isn't a unique phenomenon. Architecture is too important to be left to the architects, and this dictum is even more true when dealing with monuments. Nevertheless, international architectural competitions, like international exhibitions, seem to hold out the hope of some kind of mise au point, a kind of assessment of where architecture is, where it's at across the globe, a set of sections, lateral, longitudinal, vertical, and perhaps diagonal across the profession, to use an architectural metaphor. Lateral because it enables comparison between countries, longitudinal because it confronts different types of design solution, horizontal because it may present a range of styles, And I throw in diagonal because competitions and exhibitions often throw up unexpected criteria for distinction and differentiation particular to the context. But as scientists often warn us, an experiment, what goes on in the petri dish of an experiment is always affected by the context. And looking at, for example, the international exhibition at Barcelona, what can you possibly say from this exhibition about the international state of architecture, except the dominant importance of the dictator Primo de Rivera in Spain, except, of course, that it was here that Mies van der Rohe designed the Barcelona Pavilion. Nevertheless, the League of Nations competition is a more diagnostic competition than Barcelona for all sorts of reasons. Many more architects applied for it. And the League of Nations was a truly international problem. And this is, I'm going to come back to this in a little bit. So the story can be summarized briefly. In April 1926, the League of Nations announced a competition to design a palace in Geneva to house its principal functions. A jury of 9 architects, we'll see that 9 is rather an important number in this case. A jury of 9 architects and an opening date in July followed. By the closing date of 27th January 1927, 377 entries from 42 countries by over 1,000 architects had been delivered, estimated, as I said, at 14 kilometers of drawings. After 64 sittings, the jury announced on the 5th of May 1927 that it was unable to select a winner and second prize as required, but instead identified 9 first prizes, 9 each of first and second class mentions, making 27 in all. This created a public uproar. On September the 10th, 1927, a committee of 5 diplomats was appointed to resolve the problem. On the 22nd of December 1927, on 22nd of December 1927, the committee of 5 appointed the 73-year-old H.P. Neno, you can see his project here at the top, as principal architect, despite a list of criticisms of his project, and named 4 of the other first prize winners to work with him to adapt the scheme. In September 1928, a new and larger site became available in the Ariana Park, and that opened a whole other chapter, which I'm not going to look at, but it was a chapter that was important for Le Corbusier, and I'm not going to talk about that at all. And 2 of the first prize winners, Le Corbusier and Putlitz, submitted new plans for the new site, but were ignored. This dragged on until 1929, and in June 1930, the Neno team presented execution plans for the new site, and construction began in March 1931. Construction was largely completed by 1933, and the building completed in 1937, and you can see it there at the bottom. And as everybody remarked, the finished building was very different from the building that Neno drew with his partner Flegenheimer in 1926 and 27. And we have to be very clear that the building as built is not only a modern building, but it was a building that is completely characteristic of what was the international style of the 1930s, which was stripped classicism. This is the style that completely recognizable in New York, in USSR, in Germany, in France, in Italy. And it was in that sense, this competition, as it were, correctly identified what became the dominant means of representation of authority across the world in the 1930s. So let's just think about the competition, what it represented, what it was about. And it was about a series of different, if you like, matrices, different contextual issues. One was local. I'm going to talk about each of these later, but local means the site, the actual physical site, parkland setting, and Geneva, the city where it was built. International, because it was an international project, and this was a a key debating point in the press and must have been a key issue in the jury's deliberations. Political, because the League of Nations was a completely political construction, and everything that happened to do with the League of Nations competition, even before the diplomats were appointed, were shot through with political criteria. And then only finally, architectural. What project should be the winning project? Well, part of the local, and I'm going to go through these 4 headings, part of the local context was this building, the Hotel National in Geneva, built in 1873 by Jacques-Élisée Gosse. Why? Because it was in this building that the League of Nations met from 1920. So Eric Drummond, the Secretary General, bought it in 1920. And it was here that the League of Nations had its offices. It was here that the jury sat. And if you want to think of a context and an environment, this French Renaissance style building was a context for the competition. It was also on the lakeland setting, not far from where the League of Nations Palace was to have been built. And so if we think of kind of environmental factors, you have to imagine the jury sitting in this context, French Renaissance context. And you might have thought, well, maybe they were influenced by it in that way to choose a Renaissance style, one of the very common dominant styles towards the end of the 19th century. But in fact, would they, for example, have chosen a project like this one by Solari in a Second Empire style? They didn't. And one of the reasons that they turned away from Renaissance settings was this building, the Peace Palace of The Hague, which was one of the first attempts to create an international building to represent these big issues of peace and understanding and so forth. Cited in The Hague, which was the center of international law, originally international maritime law. It was a very appropriate place to put this building. And the architect, who was a French architect, Corbusier, tried to make a building that on the one hand represented Renaissance style, but also something Flemish, something recognizably Dutch, or Flemish at least. I guess I'm thinking of Antwerp Town Hall or something like that. And this building had a very bad press in general. It's rather well liked nowadays, but at the time it was considered to be a failure of representing the high ambitions of world peace. So this is the site. It's, as you can see, outside the built-up area of Geneva at that time, in a series of parkland settings along the lake, which had been bought up by the city, and the League of Nations had to petition the city to open it up for building. It was a beautiful setting with a number of very old and beautiful 100-year-old trees, sequoia and other trees in this parkland setting. And this was a very important factor, at least in all the journalism, but also I think bearing on the thinking of the jury. And a building that had been built just before this and was just inaugurated just at the time when the jury first sat down was the BIT, the Bureau International du Travail, designed by a Swiss architect, Georges Epiteau. And it's interesting because it links the local and the international. Why? Because it was one of the first international buildings in Geneva, a building that had to represent the international and not be seen to be part of a national culture. But at the same time, and this was actually specified in the competition brief in the program, it had to respect the site, not just the trees, as few trees as possible should be destroyed, but also the landscape, the view of the Salève hills behind the Jura Alps. Max, do you want to talk? Do you want to?
No.
No. Actually, this is something, can people interrupt?
I think it's better that we wait for the Q&A. So
okay, fine. So I'll keep going. Okay. So this building was a kind of dry run for the League of Nations building. It was built in a style that, although the architect, as I say, Georges Epiteau, was Swiss, and the competition was limited to Swiss architects, which is interesting. This was part of the deal between the BIT and the city of Geneva, that Swiss architects had to be involved. But most critics didn't see this as a Swiss building at all. They saw it as a German building, as hard and functional. And one of the critics who wrote about it and who tried to defend it was Paul Boudry, who's an interesting figure. And he defended the functionalism of the building, as you can see in the quotation here, on the grounds that its unhierarchical and practical and businesslike quality was exactly suited to the function of the building. And he also said something very important about the landscape, and I think this is going to be important to consider later. But Boudry was important to us because he was a good friend of Le Corbusier, and his brother, I think it was his brother, anyway, Jean Boudry, actually edited Esprit Nouveau, published rather, editing is a French word, published Esprit Nouveau in its last years after the period of when the journal had to stop publication, it ran out of money. So the Boudrys were very close to Le Corbusier, and there's a big correspondence between them in the Fondation Le Corbusier. And Le Corbusier, for example, did a number of trips in Switzerland with Paul Boudry, who divided his time between Lausanne and Paris. And this was one of them, their visit to the Barberine Dam in the French Alps at the east end of Lake Geneva, where they saw this astonishing feat of construction, a completely automated building site with only a handful of workers, and the cement and all the building materials mixed down the valley and carried up the valley and poured into the different coffers in an automated system, an absolute miracle of modern production. And Le Corbusier writes about it in Urbanisme. And this is one of his experiences with Paul Boudry. And Boudry was interesting because he defended the BIT building. I'll just go back. Actually, I've jumped one now. He defended I've missed the slide. How strange. No, no. He defended the BIT building because of its respect for the landscape. And he says the drama goes on behind the screen of trees. And this was a good thing. And Le Corbusier must have been absolutely aware of this view of Boudry's before he set out to do the competition entry. Okay, so just thinking about classicism, to get our period eye in, we're not perhaps as used to looking at classical buildings as people were in the 20s. And there's obviously a huge range from what you call blatantly imperial. This is a literally imperial building in London, styler, hierarchic, very organized, very ornate. And there's the stripped classicism, of which this building by Behrens, the German embassy in St. Petersburg, was one of the leading prototypes, if you like, of stripped classicism, which became the dominant style of the 30s. And then there's even more stripped classicism, as we all know, in Sweden and Gunnar Asplund, but not just in Sweden, in other countries as well, at the Public Library in Stockholm. And one of the difficulties is that when we look at as we're going to in a minute, look at the projects for the League of Nations, they tend to kind of look all rather the same, or a lot of them look fairly the same because they're classical. But people in the 1920s had a much more sensitive eye, if you like, to the different forms of classicism, what they represented. And this building, for example, is unmistakably Swedish, just as Behrens's building is unmistakably German to most spectators. And again, as part of this business of getting our eye into the issues, this question of international, to show how the kind of effect that it had on journalism. This is a piece of writing from the Architects and Building News, English middle of the road, if you like, journal, important professional journal. And the journalist here begins exactly with this question. The problem is that so few of the competitors have even made an attempt to transcend their national traditions and suggest a style which would represent a synthesis of diverse styles themselves having root in the past. This is how he, but many other journalists, saw the problem. His answer to it is rather bizarre. He thinks there should be a mixture of styles between the Orient and the West, so some sort of Japanese, Chinese, European mixture. We needn't bother with that idea for the moment. But it's interesting that the direction that he took his readers was towards Scandinavian architecture. So he picked out this design by Alberg, we'll come to this later on, as being a good mixture of classical order, but lacking any specific European tradition of classical architecture. As I say, most people would have recognized this as being Swedish. Just the comparison with the Stockholm Public Library is very obvious. But nevertheless, the journalist was looking for something that somehow transcended national interests. And this is another building that he picked out as being international. He liked the project also because of the hierarchic differentiation of the assembly hall from the secretariat. But he particularly draws attention to this non-national quality to it. So then, the site politics. The jury has certain features which were necessarily political. So there had to be a British member of the jury. The British Empire and France were the two key pillars of the League of Nations. Holland was another very good reference because of, again, the Palace of Peace and the idea of international consensus and so forth. And the other countries are basically kind of fitting in between these political necessities. Architecturally, what we have is a group of men who, although they range in age from Berlage to Carlos Gatto, did not represent what we would think of as a generation gap, certainly in terms of the stylistic or their architectural preferences. Berlage and Moser were the most modern of the architects, and they're two of the oldest men in the jury. Carlos Gatto was one of the most conservative of the architects, although not actually, as it happens, a Beaux Arts architect particularly. Four of the architects had been key innovators in their countries in Art Nouveau. Horta, obviously one of the great leaders of Art Nouveau in Belgium. Carlos Gatto, somebody who worked in the modernism style in Spain just before 1900. Berlage, absolute key figure in the arts and crafts movement, or at least in the movement of the arts. And Hoffmann, of course, the leader of the Viennese secession. Two of the architects were Beaux Arts trained, and in fact, Burnett had got his diploma in Paris at the École des Beaux Arts at the same time as Neno, and he and Neno were lifelong friends. And this may be one of the explanations of the result of the jury. And the others had different kinds of training, which depended on their different countries, but all more or less Beaux Arts. But almost all of them, the Art Nouveau, if you like, architects, the Art Nouveau young men had become academic old men. So Horta, his Beaux Arts building was in construction at the time when he became the president of the jury. Le Maresquier was as you saw, a Beaux Arts trained architect who was toying with Art Deco and was considered quite a modern architect in Paris in the 1920s. This was the building that got John Burnet his knighthood, the Edward VII extension of the British Museum, 1907-1914. Burnet's interesting though, because he was someone who had taken on very early in his partnership Tommy Tate, a Scottish architect who had leanings towards modernism. It was Tate who was the kind of passeur who was the president of the jury that got Mendelssohn his competition win for the Bexhill Delaware Pavilion, the first real modern building in England in 1933. And Tate was somebody who was always forward-looking and looking to America. Both Burnet and Tate went to America, were very much influenced by America. So this is the Kodak building for George Eastman in London in 1911 by Tate working in the Burnet office. Berlage, of course, was very open to the ideas of the young Dutch architects around him. He was also very influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright. So this building, the first church of Christ Scientists, was being just completed before the jury sat down, and is clearly a modern building. Muggia, the Italian architect, was actually considered quite an influential figure technically, because he specialized in concrete buildings. He built bridges and other concrete constructions, but his architecture was firmly in the eclectic mode. And Moser was the most actually modern architect, if you like, in his actual constructions. And this is his Antoninus Kirche being built at this time, the time of the jury. And finally, Tang Bong, practicing like Asplund in what the English call the Swedish grace style of stripped classicism, here using a styler form, but otherwise extremely stripped, and very much part of the Swedish tradition. So when finally the jury made their decision, instead of choosing one first prize and one second prize and some other mentions, they failed to do this, and they came up with 9 first prizes ex aequo, and then 9 first-class mentions and 9 second-class mentions. And I said that 9 was a key number, and it won't have escaped you that there were 9 members of the jury. And what seems to have happened, well, we know happened, in fact, because there's a correspondence between Berlage and Moser, which makes it quite explicit, was that in the end, probably due to Le Maresquier's intervention, they decided the only thing to do was to give each member of the jury 1 vote for 1 project. There'd been a certain number of people who might have voted for Le Corbusier, and a certain number of people who might have voted for Neno and other projects, but they could never get a majority, and so they decided to vote 1 each. And we can more or less map this across the 3 categories, the first prize and first class mentions and second class mentions. I'm guessing at who voted for who, but I'm pretty certain that Burnet voted for Neno. As I say, he was a very close friend. Le Maresquier certainly voted for Labro, who was his student. And in fact, this broke one of the rules of the competition, as was pointed out. Muggia probably voted for the Italian Broggi. And then in the sort of more modernist end of the jury, I have to imagine that Berlage might have chosen Fahrenkamp. I don't know who Hoffmann would have voted for, but perhaps Vargo at least. Vargo was working in a more sort of eclectic form. We know that Moser voted for Le Corbusier, and we know that Tang Bong voted for Ericsson, because Berlage said that Tang Bong only voted for Scandinavian architects. So we extend this across, and we have this divide. And what has been suggested again and again, and given particularly wide publicity by Christian Zervos in Cahiers d'Art, which we'll come to later, was that there was a majority for Le Corbusier among the four more modern leading architects in the jury, but that this was defeated by the fiendish Lemerestier, who pointed out that there was a flaw in the Le Corbusier scheme had been printed and was therefore not presented in its drawn form, drawn with China ink. But actually, from the correspondence between Berlage and Moser, it seemed actually very unlikely that at any one time these four architects voted clearly for Le Corbusier. And one of the things that we'll see goes on later on is that after the fact, when the decision of the jury had been safely made, a lot of people like Hoffmann, like Tang Bong, said that they thought Le Corbusier's was the best project. But this is a little bit like what happens, after an election, where you have one candidate who is going to cut taxes and make everybody in the middle class more wealthy, and another candidate who's in favor of better health systems, and everybody votes, in fact, to favor their own pocket, but they come out of the voting booth and they say that they voted for the health scheme person. And there was something like this going on, I think, afterwards, but we'll come back to that later. So I'm just going to run through some of these projects now and try to get some sort of idea of why they were chosen, if you like, and what they tell us, if you like. So Putlitz was one of the most sort of extreme neoclassical type versions, all colonnaded, building extremely over-determined rational plan, rectangular assembly hall, which, as Le Corbusier would point out, would be terrible for acoustics, and so forth. But it was chosen probably for its clarity, and I guess that really. A Nanos Scheme is actually quite a subtle scheme, probably because of his partnership with Flegenheimer. He's one of those who, in his renderings, brings out the landscaping and the view from the lake with the hills behind. This is actually, the perspective view is fully designed to be sympathetic to the Swiss Genevan audience. The plan could be seen as being a sophisticated Beaux Arts plan, creating a clear hierarchy between the assembly hall and the administrative offices, but it had lots of flaws, which I won't go into now. Lefebvre was a Beaux Arts architect, which again matches the kind of Beaux Arts criteria, but actually was turned out to be one of the most expensive of the designs to build, and has a very strange feature that the main central area here of the building, which you'd imagine would be the assembly hall, turns out to be a huge vestibule joining the assembly hall and the administrative areas. Then we have Labro, and Labro was Lemerestier's student, and there's no other reason that I can imagine why it would have been chosen. Then we have the interesting examples of architecture, which was much more in fashion at that time. This is very much the Italian, the type of Italian fascist architecture, stripped classicism, monumental, and with a sort of giant scale to it. Fahrenkamp, who was a key figure in German architecture at the time, his project features a tower, which is unusual because although the competition program doesn't prohibit a tower, as the competition project for the bit did, it was something that most people criticized. So, but he has a tower. But this is a styler, rationalist building, and again Ericsson, the Scandinavian architect, who does the rather strange thing of presenting the administrative buildings towards the lake, although they don't get a view of the lake, but the best view from the lake is of the administrative buildings to one side. And then Vargo, which seems to be a very anomalous plan, very anomalous project, except that the plan is actually quite a good one in some ways. But it's a mixture of all different styles, and it's very interesting reading the correspondence between Moser and Berlage, and that they all very contemptuous of this project. And in fact, they're contemptuous of Burnett, because apparently it was Burnett in the end who insisted that Vargo's project that the Vargo, the architect, should be included with these three other architects to work with Nanos. And then Le Corbusier. And Le Corbusier and Pierre. And their project, the first thing that you notice about it is the significance of the landscaping. We'll come back to how this was done in a little bit, but this was aimed at a Genevan audience, among other things. It's kept low, the trees are given big prominence, the hills are shown behind, and it leaves as much open, or it claims, this perspective claims to leave as much open of the parkland setting as possible. And then we can do the same thing for the first class mentions. I'm going to go through these quite quickly. I'm not even going to name the architects, but you get the same idea. It's a mixture between classicism, more or less strict classicism, with the rationalist designs in the middle, and then things which are more modern. This is the second class projects now, classical or rationalist. Piacentini, it was interesting that he didn't get a first class mention. Luthmann, who was known mostly for his radio transmission building in Holland. Hendricks, again a second class mention, but would have absolutely against everything that the Genevan architects would have approved, or the Genevan public would have approved. It's a massive building dominating the lake. And again, Alberg, whose design we've already looked at. And Meyer and Wittwer, who got a second class mention. Now, their project is extremely interesting because it belongs to the class of competition entry, which one would say is clearly not designed to win. And this is something actually that happened to Le Corbusier, especially in the 50s and 60s. I remember talking to assistants who worked with Corbusier, who said he was desperate. They would work on a competition entry and then trying to follow the rules and everything. And Le Corbusier would make sure that their design could not possibly win the competition by either making it too big, or sending it in too late, or doing something wrong. And this is part of the whole idea that, and it goes back to an earlier period, that a competition is a window to your production. It's not designed to win the competition. It's designed to show your position as an avant-garde architect. So losing a competition and getting into the architectural magazines was a good result. So, for example, it's interesting that Merkelbach, it's interesting to know why Berlage didn't choose Merkelbach, probably because this was much too office-like a building, and it didn't aim at some nobility. So one of the interesting things here in this section is to say, well, okay, they didn't agree about a lot of things. They didn't agree about style, but the jury probably did agree about some things. And one thing was like in this case, the need for monumentality, some kind of monumentality. And although Meyer and Wittwer get in, most of the other projects make an attempt at monumentality and some sort of international quality. Why didn't Neutra and Schindler get a mention? This is a rather brilliant design in many ways, but again, it's probably to do with this the idea of monumentality and the idea of some sort of internationalness. And again, why didn't Berlage go for Dico, we knew very well and worked with? This is again a rather a good design, and it certainly has a monumental quality, but it's probably too dominant over the landscape and breaks too many of the rules of the competition, including preserving the trees and the view to the mountains behind. Why didn't Pierre get a mention? This is extremely interesting, and I find it difficult to understand why Bonatz should have been selected over Pierre in this strict classicism, functional classicism slot, if you like. And I can't give you an answer to that. But I think I can understand why, of the hard, if you like, neoclassical projects, Skagen lost out to Putlitz, because this is an even more abstract and, if you like, over-determined building compared to Putlitz's neoclassical project that we looked at right at the beginning. And we've looked at that already. So what else did the jury agree on? Well, I think one thing they agreed on is, yes, actually, that's why I showed that, is the old adage that you shouldn't reveal your sources too much. Eclecticism was now a bad term. And even Neno, as we'll see later on, says that he is against the old things. So it was now no longer possible to be too historicist, not to show your sources too much. So this Otto's version of the Escorial, or the École Militaire, with the Escorial more likely, with a bit of Santa Grazia Milan thrown in, is just too historicist. There's too much Hagia Sophia here, and there's too much Juvara here to be acceptable. Another thing they agreed on was they were all against Expressionism. So Pelzig was out. Huyg's building was out, especially for its plan, which is clearly part of a Stadtkrone type plan. They were against tall buildings, which was a clear understanding of the wishes of the people who set the program. So this project was out. And they were against two monovalent projects, like this one by the Englishman Bell, which would have created a kind of British Library reading room with all the functions of the League of Nations around it. Or this by Oscar Garrison, again, a monovalent single idea into which everything, the multiple functions of the League of Nations have to be shoehorned, or this even more so, by Birkenholz. And this again, which is a kind of version of Bruno Taut's steel building for an exhibition. This again, it's a skyscraper building, it's too American looking, and it just wouldn't have been possible. So in the end, we can see that these two very different projects by Neno and Corbusier did have certain things, a number of things in common. They respected the landscape. They made a clear hierarchical distinction between the assembly building and the secretariat. They kept low, horizontal scale, while also aiming at monumentality, and especially with the interiors. I'm not going to go into the interiors very much, but they both offered spectacular assembly halls. You can see the plan. So things got more complicated when the group of 5 diplomats were given their brief. And one of the things they had to do was to check the cost estimates of the different projects, of the prize-winning projects. And they did this, and the Schweizer Bauzeitung came up with some published results. So instead of the 13 million Swiss francs that the brief was supposed to have been for, Nano would have been over twice at 27 million, Broggi at 40 million, Vargo at 30 million, and Lefebvre at 50 million. And this created a big scandal in the international press, especially when the jury then proceeded to increase the budget to, surprise, surprise, 26 million. They did this partly by factoring in the sale of the Hotel National, but also just simply by adding to the budget and said it had to be built with this larger sum. Now, one of the things that becomes interesting at this point is that really from the outset, from the publication of the jury's first selection of the 9 ex aequo projects, Le Corbusier and his friends, and these in particular Siegfried Gideon, Jean Badevisi in Paris, and Christian Zervos, and many others, were able to turn the discussion of the competition into an international debate about the state of architecture. This is a book we all know in Maison and Palais that he published eventually only in 1930, but it was based on lectures that he gave in Geneva and Zurich in 1928. And it includes a whole range of arguments which are about his project, but which are also about not only modern architecture, the need for modern architecture, but the need for a modern architecture which is responsive to sight and can fit in to a particular place. And then finally, a modern architecture which is also monumental. So in the book, and you imagine, I mean, it's quite explicit in Maison and Palais begins as a lecture, and this was a lecture. You can imagine these being slide projections. He showed the site with the hillside. He shows his photo collage. And incidentally, it's quite interesting. He shows how he tricked this out. These are the 2 photographs he cut up to create the correct perspective to be able to put his project in there. And the different views that he showed are all very clever visual rhetoric. They're designed to make his project seem paysagiste, to be a landscaped project. And then he introduced a whole series of arguments, which, while being technical arguments in favor of his project, were also generalizable arguments about the significant ways in which modern architecture could defeat other kinds of architecture. So here we have the acoustics. Now, we know that it's a long story about Le Corbusier and Gustave Lion, the acoustic expert in France, who designed the acoustics of the Salle Pleyel, but had also improved acoustics on a number of other buildings. I'm told, incidentally, the acoustics for the Salle Pleyel were terrible. But anyway, he had this very important reputation, and he advised Le Corbusier. And so Le Corbusier pointed out that circular buildings, square buildings were terrible, and that you needed to have what is effectively the classical fan-shaped building of the typical opera house. And he showed how the cross-section of his assembly hall were based on this, which is a perfect acoustic profile, according to him, which produces the best transmission of sound to the far seats in the hall, slightly adapted, lowered in order to bring the building down to the height that he wanted to achieve to give the view. So this is a sophisticated technical argument which was included in his project, in the description of his project, and which is simply not present in any of the other schemes, as far as I know. Then there was a question of circulation. The brief for the League of Nations was absurd in a way. There was an assembly hall that had to be used once a year only for 2,600 people, dignitaries that would arrive in their cars. And then perhaps 3 times for council meetings, and then perhaps one other time for the BIT, the Bureau International de Travail, were allowed to hold its meetings, or big meetings there also. So there had to be this ability to absorb a huge number of vehicles and people arriving all more or less at the same time. And Le Corbusier used his pilotis to produce a great line of car parking and also a one-way system of circulation, which again, nobody had gone into this kind of detail before. And so this is part of the kind of propaganda campaign that was built up after the competition was held. And then this circulation was also carried through into the assembly building itself with separate routes and separate levels for the different people. So this is the level of the delegates. They come up these big staircase and they can stream through into the building. And this is their sort of level. The diplomats on a different level, and they have also access to the High Commission rooms, which were placed alongside. And all this led up to the roof garden, where there was a restaurant. There were views, magnificent views, both ways across the lake and across to the hills and so forth. Again, this human aspect of the use of the building had not been developed, and certainly wasn't developed rhetorically by any of the other competitors. And then there's the whole thing about heating. He claimed to have solved the problem of heating with this mur neutralisant, this big cavity wall lined in beautiful cast glass panels, which would have let in the diffused light, lots of light, but also kept the place warm in winter, with this idea of pumping hot air in between the two panes of glass, which we know probably would never have worked, but that was his argument. But above all, his competition designs are funny, they're human. They invite the visitor in to imagine the work of the workman cleaning the windows, for example, of the orators. As Ken Frampton says, you know, you can imagine a portrait of Le Corbusier speaking and of Perret sitting down. But yeah, you can see this, you can imagine these kind of caricatures of people. Or here the comic figures of the international diplomats. And this, which I take to be Le Corbusier himself and Madame de Mondreau in sort of characteristic poses. These sketches are, I'm certain, by Pierre Jeanneret, and they who had a kind of comic style of drawing, which we see in a number of his drawings. And incidentally, you can see here in this detail the technique that Pierre Jeanneret used of producing this spray effect with a toothbrush to give the rendering of the blue light. And again, this the humanity of it, you know, the fact that the life of the Secretariat was seen as people standing, looking out over the view, of having a garden where they could move around, and having the trees and all this sort of putting the spectator into the space was just going deeper into the psychology, if you like, of just the cultural critic, but above all, the public critic. And it's interesting that he was so confident in the power of his renderings that he was able to say in this caption in Maison Palais, he just gives a quote, a hostile quote. It's a factory, people say, this isn't architecture. He can put that and feel certain that anybody looking at the drawing will not agree. What's interesting, of course, about visual rhetoric is that it often doesn't work. I mean, many people looking at this would see a factory, just like many people looking at the Villa Savoye see it or saw it as a factory or some sort of impersonal construction, a building, not architecture. And Corbusier steps over the line in modernist terms towards the monumental. Ken Frampton discusses this, and I think quite wrongly, incidentally, this is, I'm sorry, Ken, this is not a crow, this is an eagle. And he sees this as well, I'm not going to go into his analysis. I have two possible analyses of this system. It's, on the one hand, it's a play on the living animals of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, which was also the symbols, the icons used for the four evangelists. If you turn the ox into a horse, we have the four evangelists. So I rather think that it's something else. I think it's the three ages of the antique. And here I agree with Ken that the man and the horse do look a bit like the Dioscuri of the Roman Dioscuri. And then the lion of Venice and the eagle of America. I think this could be the three ages of architecture. But anyway, what's important about it is that it's speaking a non-functionalist language. It's presenting the idea, which is called for in the brief, in the program for the League of Nations project, that it must symbolize world harmony. And either through the Christian metaphor or through the metaphor of history, this is, I think, Corbusier trying to suggest that, as he always said, everything I do is based on the past, but also everything I do is based on man, universal man. Then, of course, there's the wonderful way that Corbusier's rhetoric works in Maison and Palais. He tries to, I think pretty successfully, separate out completely the ancient and the modern, to make the distinction between himself and Neno absolute, between the old and the new, between the dead and the living. So here, des voix d'outre-tombe. This is actually based on a piece of journalism about the wireless, but des voix d'outre-tombe, the way you read it is that this is the voice of the dead. This is a séance with the dead of the past coming together in the Beaux Arts schemes. So the debate, as it took place in Switzerland and across the world, can be divided into four, if you like, strands. The various expressions of nationalist sentiment, an attack on the jury for failing to carry out its mission, the consolidation of the criticisms by the traditionalists of modern architecture, and the consolidation and temporary unification of the progressive around Le Corbusier's project. It's interesting that this scheme by Alexander von Senger, which was a scheme that wasn't given a mention, von Senger used the debate around the League of Nations to fire up, if you like, his very violent polemic against Le Corbusier, the cheval de Troie du Bolchevisme and the Brandfackel Kommunismus. So on the right, if you like, the nationalist argument was that modern architecture was Soviet, communist, and therefore had to be resented. And it's interesting how Neno himself was interviewed in, I think it was July 1927, very quickly comes out and says, no, this is a victory for art against barbarity. And he says, let me explain, I can't, he says, sorry, I'll go back to this paragraph here. Le Corbusier, he says, claimed that his Neno's project was sadistic, but As for me, I'm not going to say anything bad about his project. I've been practicing architecture for 60 years and I understand nothing about his project. Please explain it to me if you can. I can't explain it. No, these people are barbarians. Pretty hard words. It's interesting that also in this way he's presenting himself as a kind of nice guy, obviously. He tries to get credit by pointing out that Julius Flegenheimer, who's a Jewish architect practicing in Geneva, had suffered anti-Semitist prejudice in Geneva, and he'd taken him under his wing and made him almost his pupil, his assistant. So this question of defending against the barbarians, against the communists, against the outsiders was a very important thing. And here you can see it even in a completely nondescript piece of journalism about the winning design. The journalist, the thing he says is that it's a French architect who's won the project. So this is the kind of political aspect to it. The other thing that was going on then was this consolidation around the idea of modern architecture against the rest. And Siegfried Gideon, from an early point, dives in on behalf of Le Corbusier. Here in one piece, May 1927, he notes that two Swiss architects, Wittwer and Meyer on the one hand, and Le Corbusier and Pierre Jeanneret on the other, had managed to get mentions. So he's trying to lay the ground for getting his Swiss readers in the prestigious Neue Zürcher Zeitung to accept these modernist schemes as being Swiss and therefore something that they should get behind. And he makes this very interesting argument, again, speaking to the well-thinking intellectual rather than the architectural critic or the person who has an architectural point of view. He says this isn't a question of value or quality. He says not a question of quality, it's a question of Weltanschauung. So it's a zeitgeist argument. If you understand the world you're in, we're in a modern world, you can't accept the Beaux Arts schemes. And so he's building the ground for what will become a series of articles in Neue Zürcher Zeitung and elsewhere, where he explicitly supports Le Corbusier's project and characterizes the projects in terms of their national characteristics. The French, the Italians, the Germans, the Dutch, the Scandinavians are all given sort of national characteristics, and somehow Le Corbusier's project stands outside that in terms of the relationship to the world, a sort of objective argument for the project. This is another of his arguments, another of his articles, and I'll go through that quickly. And it's interesting that out of this debate, it was research that Gideon had been doing before that. He'd been writing about Le Corbusier's buildings and about other modern buildings, but his building, Bauen in Frankreich, came out in 1928, and it's absolutely ties in with the campaign to support Le Corbusier's project. And Le Corbusier, in his Une Maison in Paris, explicitly draws on Bauen in Frankreich, in the Bauen in Frankreich arguments, in his own arguments. So I mean, we all know Gideon's approach, the comparison between the materials available, the means available in a period affecting the architecture, from Labrouste to Le Corbusier. So the group of five, the diplomats that were appointed in September 1927, were appointed for political reasons. None of them were nationals of one of the 27 projects that were premiated or given mentions. And this is one of the reasons why we find Adachi, Osuski, Politis, Urrutia, and Hilton Young were the members of this committee. So I say, when the figures were announced for the cost of the different projects, the criticisms began to come thick and fast. And when eventually, because there was a big consensus that Nanos Scheme had a lot of defects in it, when they eventually appointed these 4 other architects to work with him, Broggi, Vargo, Lefebvre, and I forgot the other one, Neno in the middle, this also was considered a great scandal. It was a way of sort of, by the back door, changing Neno's project, but at the same time freezing out Le Corbusier and the other 3 first prize winners from having a say in the final building. Then the campaign already got underway in late 1927. This is Jean Padovisi in Architecture Vivante, campaigning explicitly for Le Corbusier's project. And Christian Zervos, who began the most devastating, if you like, of the campaigns in Cahiers d'Art, which is important because Cahiers d'Art was not an architecture magazine, it was an art magazine. It was read very widely by conoscenti in France and elsewhere, had an international readership. And he devoted 4 consecutive articles under the banner, "Who will build the League of Nations Palace?" And he, in his arguments, he is the one who gives most publicity to this idea, this myth perhaps, that at the 63rd meeting, Le Corbusier's project had the unanimous support, or had a majority support in the jury, and was only defeated because of Le Maresquier, signifying that it was printed and not done in China ink. And he quotes the Europe Nouvelle. Now, Europe Nouvelle is interesting because it was edited by Mademoiselle Weiss, and we know from Corbusier's diary that Le Corbusier had several meetings with Mademoiselle Weiss. So if she, and nobody seems to have published this thing, and I haven't found it in Europe Nouvelle, but it almost certainly came from Le Corbusier himself. Zervos also does a big job of drawing together international people, statements from international people in support of Le Corbusier's project. And he sets up a questionnaire which he sends to all sorts of people. And it's here where people who are probably quite divided in their opinion in the jury process, for example, Hoffman, as I said before, were able to come out and said they supported Corbusier's scheme, whereas they almost certainly hadn't in the jury. And even Berlage, there's an interesting moment where Berlage visits the Weissenhofsiedlung and is very disturbed by the 2 houses that Corbusier had built, and said they were shockingly badly built. And we have to remember, of course, that the Weissenhof buildings, the buildings by Gropius and many of them, Stam, Le Corbusier, were criticized on the left as well as on the right. They were criticized by modernists as being not functional, as having absurd features to them. The fact that in the double house, Le Corbusier's double house, there's no wall dividing the bathroom from the living room and so forth, was a point made not just by conservative critics, but by modernist critics as well. So Berlage had his doubts as well about Le Corbusier, though he was prepared to go with Moser in general support, if he could. And so we find a number of people coming together. Some of them being rather uncomfortable bedfellows. Here we have the Redressement Français, which was a group of industrialists led by Ernest Mercier and Lucien Romier, who were on the far right of French politics. And Mercier was an important figure for Corbusier because Mercier helped him out with Pessac. Pessac, if you remember at this time, was suffering the fact that virtually nobody had moved in. Nobody wanted to buy the houses. The houses were beginning to get stained and cracked and so forth. And it was Mercier who helped to change everything and eventually get Louis Loucheur to accept that they should get funding from the Loi Loucheur. So this is a kind of confluence of allies from various different places. And it all leads up to an appeal to the world elite, which was a document that Le Corbusier designed. I mean, it was a printed document with a nice cover and everything. It was printed in large numbers and distributed in German and French in various places around the world, and sent to a whole list of people, from Benedetto Croce to Charlie Chaplin to Citroën to Auguste Lumière to Dalcroze to Jules Romain, Romain Rolland, Rockefeller, and so forth. The world elite, Cocteau, Blériot, etc. In an attempt to snowball a kind of world public opinion that would, even after the jury had made its decision, and even into the time when the group of 7 were working, they hoped would change opinion. And Le Corbusier mounted an exhibition, which he held in Zurich and Geneva and in many other places, in which he handed out this appeal to the elite, in which he tried to change opinion way into 1930, when it was obviously much too late. And what's interesting about this is that in this whole process, here you can see, for example, this is Corbusier's own personal list of people to have meetings with. Fontaine in the bit, Mademoiselle Weiss, you can see there, the director of l'Europe Nouvelle, Ossowski, one of the members of the group of 5 diplomats, and so forth. Camille Martin, architect of the city of Geneva, and so forth. So there's a whole huge effort of diplomatic persuasion that Le Corbusier went into. But in this process, what's so interesting is that the architects, the modern architects, and even kind of people on the fringes of modern architecture, all joined in, because Gideon and Corbusier managed to make this about the living and the dead, about the old and the new, about the youth against the old guys. And so all sorts of people like Mart Stam, Tiger, Hannes Meyer, André Lursa, all people who were very quickly sworn enemies of Le Corbusier soon after, already at CIAM, the CIAM meeting in 1928, they all signed up for Corbusier's campaign, Gideon's campaign, in favor of Le Corbusier's project. And so this is why this competition becomes of sort of more interest than just of itself. It became the moment in which modern architecture was drawn to everybody, to the newspapers and to debates, if you like, in general art magazines, in thinking people's newspapers and so forth. And this is just a little snippet of Le Corbusier writing to his mother and talking about this diplomatic drive. He says that la plus noire diplomatie is going on, and I'm very resigned and so forth. He felt he was dealing at a world diplomatic level, and he met heads of state like Benesch. He met all of the members of the group of 5, the diplomats and so forth, and tried to bring them round. But I mean, one of the things that's very clear when you read all these documents is that he was very naive. He was played by others. For example, he had a meeting with Le Moresquier, in which he came away from this meeting believing that Le Moresquier would support him, and there was absolutely no question of that happening at all. And then it went further because he prepared a petition, which was printed. This is his bozzetto for it, in which he tried to force the League of Nations. This was sent to the Secretary General of the League of Nations to try to get them to reverse the decision of its own committee and allow Le Corbusier to be a member of the group of 5 architects who would be in charge of the building. And it shows his project and compares to the other project, and he's claiming plagiarism. So he claims in this was a document that was prepared by a lawyer, Prudhon, and he claims that between the original projects by the 5 architects that they had submitted in 1927 and what was being presented in the combined project, there was no comparison, and that all the changes were the result of looking at Le Corbusier's own project. And actually, there's a couple of tiny things that might be true about it, but basically it's completely untrue. Most of the changes here came out of the 5 architects themselves. But this is actually in the wrong place. This is just to show that this is a Japanese version of Une Maison en Palais. These debates where in Une Maison en Palais he presents the requête, the petition, were given worldwide publicity. And then he followed this up later on with another petition in which he claimed plagiarism, and he claimed for over 1 million Swiss francs of compensation for loss of earnings and for the work that he put into it. So the building that was built was a long way from any of the original projects, it's true. As I said before, we have to accept it as a modern building. You couldn't imagine this building being built in 1880s. It's technically modern, and it's just an example of many authoritarian buildings of authority, I should say, built in every country in the world. And curiously, the interiors were given over to Art Deco designers. This is René Proux, the French Art Deco designer, and the wall paintings are by José Maria Sert, who also did the murals in the Rockefeller Center. And here we have, curiously, a representation of the building of the Palace of the League of Nations by one of Mussolini's favorite painters, Camillotti. And finally, a little footnote. It's a building which I hadn't come across at all until I did the work for this lecture, because it doesn't exist anymore. But the building behind that you see there is the Hotel National, where the League of Nations were meeting up until 1937. And in 1933, they decided to host the first big meeting on disarmament, and there were going to be so many people that they couldn't house them all together in the Hotel National. And so they asked an architect to design this building, and this building is the first modern building in Geneva, or at least you can say it's more or less the same time as the Maison Clarté by Le Corbusier. So if you like, kind of Meyer and Wittwer and Le Corbusier kind of went out behind the scenes in this building. This building was destroyed later in the fire. But it's a curious kind of turn of fate that some of the same people, presumably, who were working on the juries for the League of Nations would commission this building to provide a practical function in their workings. Okay, that's it. So, questions?
Thank
What
you
do I do
very
now?
much, Tim, for the ever erudite lecture. I believe our students have some questions.
Do I stop sharing now?
Yes.
Okay, good.
And then you
Okay,
are
good. I can see some students.
Yeah. So who would like to begin?
I can jump in and say something.
Hello?
I mean, it's quite intimidating to have Mary and Max on the screens and then having students asking questions. I had more like triggering ideas and that were popping out of your presentation. On the one hand, I think it's quite interesting the sort of failure of choice of the jury, because at the end the majority were non-modern driven architects, right? But then I was also sort of thinking if all of the Beaux created after the competition by Le Corbusier, how did he manage to, a year later, design the Villa Savoye that became one of his canonical projects? So I was sort of wondering if there was a link in between having his commission in 1928 of the Villa Savoye and sort of like the press recognition he received or he generated after the competition. So I was just wondering if there was any sort of connection between this project somehow.
Well, good question. I mean, what my response to that would be to turn it around a little bit. I mean, the Villa Savoye was a continuous extension of his modernist houses from the Maison La Roche right through to the Villa Savoye. There's a continuous line there. And a key point on that line is the Villa Stein de Monzy. And his book in Maison and Palais is actually about the League of Nations project on the one hand, but the Villa Stein de Monzy on the other. So in Maison, a house, in Palais, the house was the Villa Stein de Monzy. What's interesting is that on the cover, he doesn't show a picture of the Villa Stein de Monzy. He shows a fisherman's hut in the Bassin d'Arcachon. So one of the interesting things about this is that the way I read this is that he's trying to present himself not as a modernist in style architect, presenting himself to the public for the League of Nations, but rather a human architect. You know, an architect who can be sort of taken outside the side story, if you like, of modernism. Somebody who is claiming universal international status. It's the only way I've been able to understand this selection of that drawing on the cover of In Maison and Palais. Thank you.
Yeah, I have one question.
Yes. Hi.
Oh, okay.
Daniela. Hi.
Yes. Hello. Thank you for the lecture. My question is: when Le Corbusier mentioned the idea of the project as a conception paysagist, was he influenced by the presence of the lake and the appeal to the public opinion, or was it an ideal he was developing by the time, like this idea of the insistence on landscape, and if we can see it in relation with other projects?
I'd split that into two, my answer to that. On the one hand, Le Corbusier was always reluctant to destroy a tree. I mean, right from the Maison La Roche project, where he wouldn't let his neighbor cut down his tree because his neighbor was worried that the tree might fall over and damage the Roche house. Le Corbusier made a whole indentation in the house to allow for the tree because he wouldn't want his neighbor to cut the tree down. So Corbusier was always very keen on preserving trees. But I think there's another side of it, which is to do with the Genevan context and the landscaping and so forth, and that comes from the experience of the BIT project of the Bureau International des Travailleurs. And that is the perspectives. The perspectives exaggerate the place of the trees and make a paysage, a landscape, out of his project. And the fact that he goes to such lengths in his written project and in his defenses of his own project to use this term paysagiste. Paysagiste is not just protecting trees, it's creating an architected landscape.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.
Shall I try it?
Yeah.
Yes.
How do you see this fact that Le Corbusier had three big international projects in which he should build for the humanity, which all had a sort of terrible process of development, and also the fight he was doing to get the project done. So this is the League of Nations one. The Central Use is the other one. And of course, the United Nations, this question with Niemeyer, and so is the third one. How do you feel his position and his dealing with these things? Why it worked like that? And is there Could you say something about that?
Sure.
Oh,
yeah, yes. I mean, it's the League of Nations. It's the Palace of Soviets, especially, isn't it? And then
it's Palace of Soviets. Yes.
Yes, the United Nations. Yeah. Well, my view, and it's a little bit off the wall, is that the League of Nations built up a kind of phobia with him, a real. I mean, the League of Nations, the defeat of the League of Nations, gave him a sense of martyrdom, which he cherished after that. So the Palace of Soviets, I think he went into that knowing he would fail, and some of the ways in which he presents the project would support that. I mean, it's a long argument on that. You know, we'd have to go into it more in detail. But when you get to the League of Nations, I'm certain that's the case. That he went into it expecting to be defeated by the Americans, and in the end was very caught out that he was sidetracked by Niemeyer, because Niemeyer actually went round him, if you like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this. I mean, I think it's part of the avant-garde mentality. You know, it's a version of the artist in the garret who can only be famous after their death. You know, that losing competitions is part of the hard road that the modern artist must take. And if you don't lose competitions, you're giving in, you know, in some way. And I mean, we see it in some modern competitions now. I was talking to somebody here in Paris who's an engineer working with Rem on the project for the Montparnasse Tower. And Rem clearly went into that project with absolutely no intention of winning it at all. My friend said they were chatting together, and he'd said to Rem, one of the things he really liked, complete anecdote, was in London was the big wheel, going up in the big wheel and seeing the city from the top of the big wheel. And you get this unique view above all the other buildings. And then Rem came back next day with a project of a wheel. So, I mean, which he then transformed in various other ways. But this idea that it's the role of the avant-garde architect to fail loudly in public is something that Corbusier lived, I think.
Okay.
And it fueled his paranoia about authority and a number of other things.
I think so.
Do you agree?
Yes, I feel it like that a little bit too, yes.
Yeah. The League of Nations project was terribly wounding for him. He suffered hugely. If you read his letters to his mother.
So because it was the beginning of his career in a way, yes.
Well, because he came so close. And it's this thing of having this adulation on the one hand, of being supported by all these people pushing him forward as the representative, the spearhead of modernism, and then being rejected at the same time. I think it's a terrible experience to have gone through.
Hi. Yeah, I have another question about like relating to the like today, like because we were talking about contemporary architecture now. So based on the statement that competitions are about the judgment of different architectural styles, like for example, this one was about modern movement against classicism in a way. What do you think is the question of style in today's competitions? And like, do you consider style is still connected to any nation in today's globalized world in a way?
I think I don't know whether you read the little text that I put out, which had a paragraph about style. That notion of style, the notion that style should represent an age, that we should be looking for a style, no longer exists. So I don't think that use of the word style is relevant anymore. I think you can talk about, manner. You can talk about, families of architecture that compete in some ways. But in 1926, 27, a key question was basically, in what style should we build, or in what style should a national building be built? I think if you have a big international competition now, that's a completely irrelevant question. And I think a very interesting sidebar to that is that what I've described in the League of Nations Convention, which is the fact that the architects were sidelined by the politicians, doesn't actually happen that much nowadays. The architects have astonishing authority. You put together a jury, they make decisions, and amazingly, in most cases, those decisions are more or less respected. I mean, there are famous contradictory examples, but there are many cases of competitions in the 19th century and the 20th century where this simply wasn't true. The Houses of Parliament was a good example in England in the 1830s. I think now the question is to find, it's kind of like shopping for an image that the architects feel is the, sort of the best image, the best solution within architectural terms. And that is made to work afterwards by a political process. But I think the conditions have changed a lot in that way.
Thanks.
How?
Cheng Hao, yeah. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Okay. Hi. I also have a question that comes from the composition of the juries. I'm wondering if their compositions and aiming is more related to political reasons, and none of them were in architectural professions. It makes me refer to that architectural competitions, like you mentioned in the lectures and the readings. It has more political operations in the process. And I also have the similar feelings in our previous lectures. So I'm wondering if that's so, what is the position for the perspective of architectural professional to examine these architectural competitions? And does it mean that architectural profession is not that important in this kind of the competitions, but more essential for political reasons?
Right. It's difficult because political means different things. I mean, we think of political in terms of left and right, you know, Marxist, communist on the one hand, reactionary in the 30s, fascist and so forth. Or it means nationalist, you know, it means Italian, French, etc. I don't think there was a political divide in the jury in 1926 at all. They were mostly centrist, slightly veering left. Berlage was probably more left than most, Moser perhaps as well. Le Corbusier was moving to the right at this time already. So I don't think politics, in that sense of politics, of left and right politics, had a role in the competition. It had a role immediately afterwards in the debates in around CIAM, in the first conference of at CIAM at La Sarraz, where politics became extremely important, and the hard left attacked Le Corbusier for being a lyricist, but also for being bourgeois. But I don't think it was an issue so much in the League of Nations competition itself. And there's a big problem with politics and architecture in general, as we all know. I mean, an architecture of the left is normally characterized as being housing and hospitals and clinics, and it's very difficult to follow through the idea of an architecture of the left of power, even in, especially in communist and strongly socialist states. These states do not move towards modernism in their architecture, except brief moments. So I think it's a big problem if you're looking at competitions of this kind, which are to do with big international or national monuments. That was another thing which perhaps I should have said more in the lecture is this question of the monumental, which was a big problem for architects, modern architects, and which this project presented in an acute form. Many architects, especially modern architects, did not compete, like Mark Stam, for example, didn't compete because it was a monument, and the monument must represent the capitalist state, and therefore this is something that shouldn't be encouraged.
Thank you.
Wanting?
Yeah, actually, following up on the monumentality question, I was wondering, like, because this was sort of a transition for Corbusier also to move from the houses and to the bigger scale. Yeah. And I felt like in the reading also that it formed certain base for him to create also the buildings in Chandigarh, like the Palace of Justice and the Palace of Assembly, because there are certain, transposition of his elements which can be seen there. And the other question I was wondering was, it really established the position of an architect among also the politicians, or like the diplomatic arena. Like that's what I understood from the discussion with Corbusier's aggressive, retaliation sort of. Or what was the response of jury? Like, did they ever respond to it, or so both?
Yeah, it's difficult to answer. I mean, I think the question of Chandigarh is very interesting, because Chandigarh was the chance for him to do finally what he'd wanted to do with these big projects for the Palace of Soviets and from the League of Nations, and finally do big monuments. Monuments heavily symbolic. Weighted with symbolic meaning, and of course very important for him was to try to use what he understood of the Indian meaning, Hindu symbols and so forth in his building, and that is there's a line, there's a continuous line that goes from the League of Nations to Chandigarh. You're right to point that out. It's very important. I'm not quite sure about the second half of your question, because I don't really know how to answer it. I mean, as far as the jury was concerned, I don't think most of the jury understood Le Corbusier's project, and certainly didn't understand his claims that it was monumental, or that it was architecture with a big A. As Nanos said, he wasn't in the jury, but as Nanos said, he didn't understand the project, and I think most people wouldn't have understood it from that point of view. I don't know whether that helps.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Marianti, you had a question?
Yes. Well, just trying to
the
clarify scales of the competition, and also, can you hear me now?
That's a bit better, yeah.
Yeah, just to clarify this chaos that was this competition of this diverse jury and diverse entries and the results, and also building on the monumentality topic. You mentioned that like the monumentality as well, the international quality was like what it was asked for from this building, but was those two attributes like explained in the briefing, or was it something that was built through the multiple examinations during the examination period? And was it something progressive, having to say that we need this international quality at the time?
Yes, you've actually made a criticism of my presentation, in fact, because I meant to quote the piece in the brief, which talks about the symbolism, and it says that this is a building that should be represent a world monument and so forth. So that was in the brief. In answer to your question, it was in the brief. The second part, I mean, I don't think that being international. Well, right, okay, let's take this back. Being international was a founding principle of modern architecture. That's true. So, and was something that modern architecture was criticized for by people on the right who took a nationalist position. So many of the key books on modern architecture, like Gropius's Internationale Architectur, or Hilbersheimer's book, they have the word international in it. And international, which was also a socialist term, because the idea is that socialism is an international phenomenon, was also linked, of course, to communism because of the Internationale, which sent out orders to communist parties throughout the world and so forth. All this was something that was associated with modern architecture in the 20s and into the 30s. But the way that the idea of international was presented in the League of Nations competition, Palace competition, was not something that lines up with that exactly, because what it's not talking about an international brotherhood of man. It's talking about nations, representing nations. It's a unity or a conglomeration of nations, and that's something that modernism had a lot of difficulty coping with. Even right up until the United Nations project in 46, 47 in New York, where in fact what happened was that the dominant international style was the style that was used. So I think it's an interesting question about whether international in itself was a modernist attribute. It was, but not in the sense in which the people who framed the competition thought about it. It was, though, incidentally, more so in the question of the Bureau International de Travail, the BIT, where the brief is specific about the community of world workers, the proletariat in the whole world being represented by this building and how this building should represent that. That was specifically specified.
Do we have any final questions?
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to return to this idea of monumentality and the choice that Le Corbusier took to represent it with, to some extent, flirting with a French rational classicism. And in one of the passages that really sort of was emblematic to me from your text, and I quote here, you say that the League of Nations competition was a Pandora's box for Le Corbusier, opening up an international arena of undreamt publicity and world attention, but burdening him too with responsibility for the politics of the vanguard. So I wonder if you would infer that losing this competition radicalized Le Corbusier's position towards the past, knowing that the one who won this competition was also and pretty much using the neoclassical style.
Actually, what happened is the opposite, that it turned him more to the right for two reasons. One, that he found as I said, he found allies on the far right who would support him in his campaigns and who supported him in his world appeal, for example. The people, therefore, people who would see modernism as a new kind of revolutionary totalitarian style, like for a moment Mussolini thought, for example. And the other reason is that he experienced very quickly after this sort of high moment, early 1928, the attack of the political left on his work, particularly on his Montanéan project, but also on the League of Nations project. So he became very embittered with the left, with Marxists, with communists, who were arguing for a Neue Sachlichkeit, for a genuinely functional architecture. And although he was being accused of being a Bolshevik and so forth, right and left, he was moving much more in the search for authority. And I think one of the fatal lessons that he learned from the League of Nations competition was that he'd never achieve his aims unless he found a way of appealing to authority. So his book, La Ville Radieuse, 1935, says this book is dedicated to authority. and he felt you have to, unless you win the political battle, you can't win the architectural battle.
Wow.
And that's a fatal flaw, fatal problem for him. Because of course he lost the political battle as well. Sorry.
No, I wondered if Steph had one final question.
Sure.
Something I'm quite, what strikes me as quite curious is these 64 meetings that the jury had. But it seems as though there's not that much documentation of these 64 meetings. There's the letters between Berlage and Moser, for example. But I was wondering how much is known of those meetings and how much documentation is left for those countless moments.
As far as I know, the documentation between Moser and Berlage, which is in this book, Corbusier and Anciano, which I refer to, is the best insight into the jury. I don't think there's anything else. I don't think any of the other people, as far as I know, wrote about what went on. But I haven't done the research, and as far as I know, nobody's done any archival research to find those sources. It would be very interesting to know.
Yeah, I mean, there must be notes, you would say, with all these projects and all these meetings.
There must have been notes, and even more so, there were normally, in a thing like that, there would be reminiscences afterwards. You know, people normally put them into their memoirs, or they write to their loved ones or something, and this turns up in family archives and so forth. But as far as I know, nobody's done that work, and I certainly haven't.
Yeah, thank you.
This is why I tried to very superficially go into what the jury might have had in common, what they might have agreed about, and what they didn't agree about. But it's all supposition. Supposition with a little bit of hints from Moser and Berlage. But if you're interested, I do recommend that you look at this book, because it's got some interesting documentation.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Good.
So it was a wonderful lecture. I think it really added to, well, it complemented very much Christopher Meade's lecture last week on the Paris Opera House. So it took us into the 20th century. So thank you so much for, well, maintaining your commitment to do the lecture in this revised format. So we thank you for the scholarly camaraderie. So thank you very much. So I guess still do a round of applause here, even in the virtual way.
The virtual way.
Thank you.
Thanks, Salomon, and thanks to all of you.
And we will find